and welcome to the show this week. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, I'm delighted that on one of his, I'm very pleased to say, regular appearances on the show, I'm joined today by Peter Hitchens, columnist for the Mail on Sunday and also the author of 20 books now?
I've lost count.
You've lost count. Okay. Good to see you, Peter.
It's good to see you too.
Very, very good to see you. I wanted to go straight in, actually. We are coming up to maybe, 6 months of this new government. What's your verdict on it?
I don't think that most of them know what they're doing. I think that some of them do. I'm absolutely seized by the contrast between Bridget Phillipson, the highly dogmatic, and it seems to me to be extremely effective for ill rather than good, Education Secretary, and the Prime Minister on Downing Street. It's clear that she knows what she's doing. She's driven by a spiteful egalitarian dogma. She wants to make it much harder for people to avoid the state education system. She's obviously a comprehensive school diehard. She also acted with amazing speed to cancel a piece of Tory legislation, one of the few of any merit, which would have protected free speech at universities. An astonishing action, by the way. The thing had actually been passed by Parliament, but she managed to stop it being actually put into effect. And she's effective. She's what I think the fundamental Labour Party are like, and in some ways I think what she's what the deep down Keir Starmer is like. But the problem with being Prime Minister is that you are actually trying to manage a flying circus, or be some kind of juggler and conjurer mixed, and it's not so easy as running an individual department. So you see in the contrast between, as I say, the highly effective spite and bad actions of Bridget Phillipson and the mess which Downing Street has been, and the mess in which I think the Treasury is as well.
And presumably the Foreign Office too. I mean,
the Foreign Office, it's still called a great office of state, but what does it do? There's nobody outside Britain thinks we're an important country anymore. Therefore, the Foreign Secretary is not an important job anymore. It's just a matter of saying things and people ignoring them, as far as I can see.
But you mentioned they don't know what they're doing. It does feel amateurish. I mean, it feels just like a lot of it pure incompetence.
Well, the thing, as indeed was, of course, the Blair government of 1997 in many ways incompetent. They didn't know what they were doing as a government, but they had to sit on the bicycle saddle and pedal wildly and ring the bell from time to time to make it look as if they were governing the country, when what they really had was a profound ideological plan to change it. But they were the problem with the Blair government was not their problem, was the country's problem, was that the opposition actually ceased to exist for the initial years of it. And far too many of the media had bought the Blair myth and the Blair public relations, and also wouldn't pursue them or give them a hard enough time over the things that they were obviously doing wrong. So they got away with it.
There is this, some people talk about tyranny and this being a tyrannical government and emanating mostly from Keir Starmer. Would you go along?
No. I think obviously all dogmatic governments have the potential for tyranny within them because they believe themselves to be so good and so right that they ultimately become utterly intolerant of opposition. But there's still more than enough of the rule of law and constitutional propriety in our country to prevent anything like tyranny. People who use terms like tyranny in countries like Britain have never seen tyrannies and have no idea what they are, and are frankly devaluing and inflating the language. It's just a silly thing to say. I don't think their instincts, the instincts of any of the people in New Labour, are necessarily towards liberty or towards pluralism, but I think that they do understand that our political system prevents them from acting in a tyrannical way, and must have known that from the start. They did, after all, gain power in an entirely constitutional manner. The fact they did so because an awful lot of people voted stupidly is another matter, but they still put themselves before the electorate in a legitimate way, and they won the election fairly and squarely, and they came into office according to the Constitution, and Sir Keir Starmer went to the Buckingham Palace to be appointed by the King. I don't think we can really call that a tyranny. It's silly.
You say people voted stupidly, or actually an awful lot of them didn't vote, is that?
Well, a lot of people never vote now. The number of people who vote in our country diminishes all the time, but a lot of people knowingly, understanding, and I said this beforehand, so I can say it now, knowingly understanding that voting for the Farageist party would help the Labour vote, and a lot of marginal constituencies did so, and have been complaining ever since that there's been a large Labour majority which they willfully obtained. I mean, one thing or the other, not both, in my view. But I think a lot of people were stupid and short-sighted in the way they voted.
Do you? I mean, it seems to me that it feels like the kind of completion of the Blairite program in some ways.
Oh, the completion of Blairism would be appalling, but it's certainly the restoration of its moving spirit. The Tories managed Blairism. They never understood it. They never realised what a serious business it was. But likewise, they never truly opposed it. So when they inherited it, they were perfectly willing to manage it.
Right.
And so the Equalities Act of 2010, probably the key piece of legislation of the entire Blair era, though it came quite a long way into it, is something which any properly conservative administration of any kind with a small c would have had to repeal. But the Tories managed it. And the famous Kerry Badenoch, or however you pronounce it, perhaps you know, was an equalities minister, for goodness sake. One of the posts created as a result of that piece of legislation.
Do you go along with the view that I've spoken to David Starkey, for example, about this, and he says there's got to be a massive great repeal act of all of this kind of constitutional, such things as the Equalities Act, Human Rights Act, but also getting rid essentially of the Lord's justice and basically replacing it with the Supreme Court, all of that constitutional vandalism, as he would call it.
Well, he would be right to call it that, but on the other hand, it's also the constitutional policy of New Labour, or the Euro-communist wing of British politics, as I more accurately call it. These were profound constitutional changes, almost undiscussed, largely unrecognised by either media or opposition in Parliament, which changed the country. And then people keep complaining about the things which have resulted from the growth of a Supreme Court, which ought in our Constitution not to exist. The problem with these things is what they also do is they gave new privileges to people who hadn't previously had them. They created new classes. The whole judiciary, for instance, has been transformed by the reforms of the judiciary under Blairism, and the judiciary has itself become a lobby for Blairism as a result, and it makes it much harder. It's all very well saying let's repeal these things, which would in an intelligent world be a lovely thing to do, to repeal all these things, but where are you going to get the support from to do so? Could you win an election on a program saying we were going to do these things? Could you, having won it, could you get the civil service to implement them? Could you get them through Parliament? Could you get them through the Reformed House of Lords, which is another consequence of this? It's not so easy. The idea of a government arriving in power with such strength that it would be able to take these Starkeyist steps seems to me to be, well, if not far-fetched, then extremely unlikely at the moment. I don't see who's going to do it.
I would agree with you there, actually. I don't quite know where opposition with that amount of sophistication, for want of a better expression, is going to come from.
No, and you're right to use the term sophistication. So much of modern conservatism is slogan shouting, borrowed policies from American thinkers, and has very little relationship to what's actually been going on here. Not least because the Conservative Party in this country has been so indolent in trying to understand what it was up against, or indeed in even noticing what was going on.
Well, speaking of the Conservative Party, I mean, this weekend they're going to elect a new leader. I mean, your advice to people at the last election was, basically to vote against Labour.
Yes.
I think that's what it was, wasn't it?
Thank you for putting it like that. Yes.
As opposed to anything else. Do you care about this leadership?
Not much. I care about some false hopes which people may be investing in either of the candidates. I hear them described as right-wing. Neither of them seem particularly so to me. They both took part in a government which was more or less Blairite, without, seems to me, particularly vigorous protest much before the end of their times in office. they show no signs in what they write and say of any profound understanding of the nature of the beast. They're not Starkists, put it like that. They certainly don't understand both the constitutional and the moral aspects of change, which have been so important. And there's still an awful lot of a belief that the great magic medicinal compound which will solve everything is another dose of Thatcherite laxative. That what we all have to do is go free market and shout rude things about the nanny state, and that will somehow or other shake off the chains of socialism. It's not like that. The chains of socialism are not as they were in 1979. And they're sticky marshmallow bonds which are not so easily cast off, and they don't have really very much to do with the free market.
So you don't have you don't think one is particularly more right wing than the other. I mean, I would say on the face of it, generic or whatever, but I've yet to hear anything particularly right wing that can be badnock.
Nor I. There was the remark I made earlier about borrowed ideas from the United States. Yeah. Seems to me to apply to her, that the people seem to think that this is the source of conservatism. Well, there are some interesting conservative ideas in the United States, but they don't apply here. American conservatism is inevitably different. American conservatism has been developed in a secular republic, not in an Anglican monarchy, and therefore has a very different aspects. It's also been developed for a presidential state rather than a parliamentary one.
Yes.
And these are wholly different, and one in which the courts have been immensely more important in the United States since they grabbed the sort of power that they're now grabbing in Britain more than 100 years ago. Those are also issues, but they don't offer, it seems to me, much of an answer. I think the fact that both these candidates are groping in this direction is perhaps vaguely encouraging, but it is groping. I don't see a sense in any of the discussion forums of modern political parliamentary Westminster conservatism or its media annexes. I still don't see any understanding of what's hit them.
Yes, I know that you've said in the past quite frequently that actually the Tory party as it stands is the biggest sort of obstacle to conservatism. That has not really changed, presumably. I mean, you don't see reform as being a possible.
Well, I don't think reform is conservative. I think reform is another aspect of this reaching for American ideas to deal with British problems.
Right.
Reform is basically a Trumpoid formation. It pronounces slogans which are appealing to the disenfranchised former Labour voters as Trump appeals to former Democrats in the Rust Belt. Though I don't know whether any more than Trump does, they have any real way of satisfying the demands which they've created.
Yes, there's no strong philosophical basis to it.
Nothing. Well, it's no one could say of Nigel Farage that he's a deep thinker. Nor do I see around him, and I think he'd probably be annoyed to be called one, but nor do I see around him any sign of any others who are. There are easy things you can say between now and tea time in British politics which will get you a lot of loud cheers and bring people onto the streets. They're very easy to say, but they don't actually amount to policy.
Therefore, what should people do in a way?
I've given up, and people never believe me. I say this over and over again. I cannot see, as I scan the horizon, any sign of any forces coalescing which would be capable of taking on the enemies which we face. They don't understand the problem. They refuse to understand the problem. They reach for the short term. They reach for the noisy slogan, and they won't think about it. And a period of profound thought is necessary, and an understanding of what you're up against. And there are still people in British conservatism who think Jeremy Corbyn is to the left of Keir Starmer. when it's perfectly obvious that the opposite is the case. And they will not think, because they prefer the easy, oh, look at the wicked Marxist Jeremy Corbyn. It's a gift to them, because they can say, oh, look, he's such an obvious old trot. That anybody can see that they don't want him to be Prime Minister. But by doing so, they do the work of the Blairites, who are far to the left of Corbyn and love to see British Conservatives raging against Corbyn when they get on with the real revolution in peace. Revolutionaries are not people climbing on barricades in stoved-in top hats, waving cutlasses. They're not rude people who burst into your office in dirty clothes, tossing the papers to one side. They're not Bolsheviks or Jacobins. They're smooth people in good suits and good hair who've been to Oxford, who've studied PPE, and who know how to dismantle one society and replace it with another without killing anybody. They're not, but people won't recognize this. They can't see that a revolution can take place under the leadership and control of people like that.
Do you think, though, that along those lines, think of that silent revolution, if you like, that's happened over a period of, 60 years, maybe? Something like that. Do you think people are a little more aware of that now?
Not in the slightest. I've been trying to make this point. I was looking back at my first book, The Abolition of Britain, now, a quarter of a century old. I make this precise point that the nature of the revolution has changed. People often come ask me and say that how much they like the book and all the rest. I don't know. I'm glad about that. But I see no sign that anybody in any position of influence or political decision-making has ever read it. Because it makes this point perfectly clearly in good, clear English. There isn't any doubt about what it's saying from a position of knowledge. You must understand what a revolution looks like now. This is what it is. This is what it seeks. This is the nature of it. And anybody can read the works of actual American revolutionaries. This is important here, because we can learn from America, such as Saul Alinsky, who pointed out back in the 60s and 70s to the huge numbers of people who'd been involved in the great anti-Vietnam War revolts, who were then going into careers in all the major areas of American life. Stop being silly. Stop expecting that you'll get what you want by going into the street and shouting. Work for your objectives. Become an effective activist. Work for your objectives, and you will obtain state power. And probably the best example of somebody who's done this in the modern world is Barack Obama, a man undoubtedly of the very firm left, but a man who did the work, who got into the machine, and who became president of the United States. So there's lots of people like this, not many of them as dramatic as that. And people, there are many, many people on the British right who've never heard of Saul Alinsky, never read his Rules for Radicals, don't know that people who had been on all the silly demonstrations and grown their hair down to their elbows and all the rest of it in the 1960s, in the 70s and 80s and 90s became serious apostles of serious organised change.
And then they chose to maybe become bureaucrats instead.
Bureaucrats, teachers above all, lawyers, and the penetration of the legal profession by revolutionists has been extremely effective, and of course that's why the Supreme Court's so important.
Actually, this takes us to a column that you wrote yesterday in the Mail on Sunday, but it is germane to that, because you refer in it, it's talking about the growth of armed police in this country, which is sort of being concomitant really with the abolition of the death penalty.
I think so. But I think there's a definite connection between the two.
But you make the point that the judiciary and the police have become politicized in this. To me, it seems that the police are completely captured, and indeed, it's the worst case of it, because they are at the hard end.
Yes, but it's interesting. The capture of the police by more or less radical ideas was quite a long, slow process, and I think it didn't become obvious to people for some time. I think it has many, many different roots, like so many other things. It doesn't have a single cause. And in my second book, The Abolition of Lucy, I went into the history of the change in the police and the way in which they stopped being withdrawn from the streets, which they were, and now obviously no one argues against this point anymore. by being withdrawn from the streets, they ceased to be the servants of the people and basically citizens in uniform as they had been, and began to become exactly the sort of gendarmerie which Parliament had originally not wanted them to be. And this made them much more attractive, of course, to radicals who began to get involved in them. But the real revolution, at least, followed the Macpherson report, which almost demanded a politically correct inquisition of the police.
This was the institutional racism.
The institutional racism, yes. And before that, there'd been the Scarman report on the Brixton events, which again, it's almost impossible to obtain now, but an absolutely fascinating read. I deal with both these reports in detail in that book, and yet I've never yet come across a politician involved in a conservative politician involved in law and order or justice or crime or prisons, all the subjects dealt with at length in that book, who's ever read it. And I pressed it into the hands of some of them. I gave it to Theresa May when she was Home Secretary. I imagine she dropped it straight in the bin. I don't know what happens. I have tried to get these ideas across, but there was interesting. Law and order discussion is always about, again, slogans, reaching down from the shelf. Let's be tough, tough on crime. Well, you're not. If you're, it's all very well doing tough things, but if they don't affect the people you're trying to affect, then they're not tough.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? Up until maybe the 90s, maybe at a push, the Tory party, people instinctively thought it was tougher. It was the party of law and order.
They had, again, the Tory party had really not understood what was going on. The first real major cultural revolution in this country was the series of private members' bills, almost all of them private, but with the exception, I think, of the Divorce Law Reform Act, which Roy Jenkins steered through Parliament with strong help from the government whips, one of them being the abolition of the death penalty. And the other hugely significant one, which was actually a government bill, the Divorce Law Reform Act of 68, 69, changed society totally. Now, the thing about death penalty is that a lot of politicians don't like it for a very simple reason. It lays responsibility on them. It's always seemed to me that if you want to become a man or woman of power, you have to accept that this means that you accept that in the end you stand in the gap with your sword against the forces of unrighteousness and danger and evil, and you protect the people, and therefore you must be prepared in doing so to take very stern actions, which may sometimes involve killing people. You don't maintain armed forces unless you're prepared to use them to kill people when they threaten the country. You don't maintain prisons unless you're prepared to put people in them. And the point about the death penalty was that it's demonstrable. I said in the article in the Mail on Sunday last week, the works of Colin Greenwood, a very interesting former policeman, show this.
Colin Greenwood,
he wrote a book called Firearms Control. And he went through the periods. There were two attempts made to abolish the death penalty before it was finally got rid of in 1965. One in 1948, when interesting, a large chunk of the then Labour cabinet voted to retain it. Unthinkable now. The other in 1957, and before and during both these, judges quite reasonably, with the backing of, I think, the Lord Chancellor, felt it was impossible to impose the death penalty because it was effectively in suspension, and it was known widely that it was in suspension. It was not there. And during that time, the use of not just firearms, but of knives and clubs, of lethal weapons of all kinds in the commission of crime went up sharply. And when it was reinstated, it dropped back again. I won't go to the complete complexities because the 1957 Act greatly weakened the death penalty, but after it was finally abolished, the amount of armed crime increased and has been increasing exponentially since. And that is what the death penalty deterred, not murder in general. You can never claim that it deterred murder in general, so much murder is impulsive and could not be deterred in any case. But that form of crime, the carrying of lethal weapons by criminals, was what increased as a result. And that, of course, has put pressure on the police themselves to become more and more armed. The invention of the taser has sort of put off what might otherwise have been a more general arming of the police, because it's given them a weapon between the truncheon and the gun, which can save lives and is useful. But it also conceals the fact that our police are much more equipped to use very heavy force than they ever were before. And that's because the safeguard of the death penalty has gone. Now, people say you can't possibly be in favour of hanging. You're busily campaigning for the reopening of the case of Lucy Letby, who's been sentenced to many terms of life in prison and would undoubtedly have been sentenced to death if there were a death penalty. So, well, I absolutely, under the current circumstances, I couldn't support a death penalty because I don't believe our courts are fair enough. I don't believe our juries are strong or independent enough. I'm totally against majority verdicts. And I also think that a lot of the media are not really capable of scrutiny of the criminal justice system or the proper coverage of trials in the way that they used to be, which made it safer to have a death penalty. So I wouldn't introduce it now under those circumstances. There'd have to be major reforms in society and a major strengthening of the media before we consider it again. But by getting rid of it, we lost something much, much more important than people thought and changed society much more profoundly. By getting rid of a death penalty following due process and jury trial, you don't destroy the state's power or willingness or ability to kill people. It will arise in a different way, in a different place. And it has arisen in a different way, in a different place, partly with the introduction of armed police, and partly, I would say, in the general devaluation of prison sentences so that they get longer and longer. And one of the many effects of that, of course, is the grotesque number of prison suicides which now take place, which in my view are a form of death penalty. So the whole liberal idea that the state could just stop killing people and everything will be all right was a mistake. Liberal attitudes towards penal policy often make things worse and more cruel.
So
the politicians don't want that responsibility. They want to be in power. They want the red boxes. They want the cars, but they don't want the true hard responsibilities that go with it. None of them wants to be the Home Secretary sitting in his office trying to decide whether to reprieve somebody or not.
But then,
can't blame them for that. I wouldn't want it either. But it is. But on the other hand, I don't want those trappings. If I did, I'd have to accept I had to take responsibility.
But if you were having a debate with one of those liberals who had a moral position about it, you would oppose it and you would be in favour of it if all of these other factors...
If all of those conditions were fulfilled, I would be, yes. But people will say to me, quite rightly, well, they're not very likely to be fulfilled, are they? But I've been arguing this since it would have been easier to fulfil those. Interestingly, again, it was a liberal reform, Roy Jenkins, the abolition of unanimous juries. It was a liberal reform of Roy Jenkins, the abolition of the property qualification juries, which I wouldn't restore, but I would have an educational and age qualification, which made them more likely to contain people of experience.
Do you think that's more necessary now because basically education has declined and people's cognitive ability?
I think the decline of education is in everything we face.
Yes.
It just is. But I think that it was always dangerous to have 18-year-olds giving jury verdicts as we do now.
You mentioned there as well about majority verdicts as well being...
they're not. It's no jury can function. The most famous film and drama about juries, the 12 Angry Men, rests on the fact that the jury must be unanimous.
Yes.
That if there's one person in the jury room of integrity and determination who says, actually, I don't accept that the prosecution has proved its case, then there can be no conviction. But since majority verdicts, that one person or even two or even three can be overridden by the majority who ultimately want to go home. It's shocking. The whole concept of beyond reasonable doubt has been so undermined in practice. The very idea that somebody sitting in a jury room who sat through the entire trial thinks that the prosecution has not proved its case means there is a reasonable doubt.
Yes.
So the moment a judge says, I will accept a majority verdict, the trial ceases actually to conform to the principles of British justice.
Interesting. But the death penalty, I remember at school having debates about it. It was always, there was always a strong public support for it, wasn't there? Strong public support.
Quite strong. I know it diminishes as it becomes more of a memory, I think.
Yes, it's certainly diminished. I mean, used to be around 60%, something like that.
And a lot of rather horrid people rejoice in the miserable lives which convicted prisoners must live as well. It's particularly heinous killers. They like the idea of them living at constant danger from other inmates, which I think is barbaric and unchristian. But they like that, so that satisfies that desire, I'm afraid. So I cheerfully get rid of an awful lot of the people who support death penalty for reasons of cruelty or callousness, because I just don't.
Yeah. One thing we've not really discussed, actually, in our conversations over the past, 4 years, is immigration, actually, which is pretty much taking all before it at the moment as the issue. And I remember something that you wrote, which you were talking about back in the 1960s when you were...
When I was a trot, yeah.
Trotsky. And you were saying it wasn't so much that we cared enormously about the poor of the world. It was more that we just disliked...
We disliked Britain as it was, and we saw immigration as a way of changing it.
But you see, that was always clear to me in my teachers and sort of growing up.
It's fascinating, isn't it? But it's almost never said.
Yes.
In fact, when I wrote it, I was writing thinking, crikey, can I say that?
Yes.
Well, it's true.
Yeah.
But it was. That was one of our major motivations. We didn't want to, and it has done so. And I think the Andrew Neither outburst, which the Evening Standard coverage often publicised about his explaining how Labour felt it was a way of changing the country in a way which Conservatives could not reverse. It echoes that. I don't think there's much doubt of it.
Right.
But the key thing about that is that the levels of immigration which we were discussing in the 1960s were so tiny compared with what has now happened that it just seems to me that any discussion of immigration now is completely constrained by the fact that it has happened.
Right.
And I'm guided, as I must be, by Christian principle here, that it having happened, what we have to do is try to make the best of it. I do very strongly believe that making the best of it would be a lot easier if we stopped having very much more of it for a while.
Yeah.
The integration of people into society is perfectly possible and extremely desirable. It's much, much harder while large-scale immigration is taking place.
Well, it's impossible, surely, at these levels.
I think there's an awful lot of goodwill, actually. And there are terrible things that happen, and of course it's always the poor and the weak who are most affected by it, and they can easily turn to people like me and say, well, you're all right. You're a well-off person living in a middle-class district of a pleasant town. It doesn't affect you the way it affects me. And I hear that, and I think it's a very good point. It must drive anybody who has any effect on the matter to think, well, yes, quite. So we must be very stern about this. We must try and bring it down to levels where integration becomes possible. But I'm afraid that I stop there. Integration has to happen, and for me it's vital that it should happen. But overwhelmingly integration, to be integration, must be on the side of turning the people who have come to your country into citizens of it, rather than altering your country to suit them.
But that's not what's happening, really.
It isn't what's happening, and it isn't what's been happening. But you can speak out against it, as I have done many times, and what does it do? But the danger speaking out about it simply to gain support and bring people onto the streets is that it doesn't make it better; it makes it worse. So I'm quite careful about what company I keep there.
Yes. With when it comes to political parties, say like Reform, Reform is sort of perceived by people to be tougher on immigration. If you actually look at what they say about it, it's actually something like 1 in, 1 out, or one of these net zero migration, 1 in, 1 out, whatever that means. I mean, I'm not putting words in your mouth. My own view is that you need actually a break, a full moratorium on it for a period of time.
Yeah, there are all kinds of things which are possible. How do you actually do them? I mean, an awful lot of praise has been lavished on Giorgia Meloni in Italy, but I don't believe, despite an awful lot of rhetoric, he's actually made all that much difference to the level of migration into Italy. And I fear it would be the same with reform. Should Madame Le Pen, or whatever she's called now, is she still called that? I can't.
Yes.
And her party, which keeps changing its name, if they ever come to office in France, it will be very interesting to see what they actually do. And until there's the main hope of a big change actually lies in a conversion of the left on this matter, which is why I place some small but flickering hope in a German politician called Sascha Wagenknecht, who is of the left and who's turned to her colleagues on the left who constantly decry the AfD and the other anti-migration parties in Germany. I'll say, don't be stupid. The people who are voting for the AfD are not voting for the AfD because they're fascists. They're voting for the AfD because they're cheesed off. And it's foolish for the left to ignore and despise these people. They're right to be cheesed off. Mass migration has not made their lives better. Why should they be? If there were any people on the left in this country who would take that view, then you might develop a consensus across Europe which would enable particularly the revisions of treaties and of other international agreements, which might make it possible to do something about it.
Yeah.
But that lies, as long as we're politically divided about it, as long as there are huge numbers of influential people in this country who are actually publicly committed to what is basically the open borders policy and won't accept that it actually harms the poor above all, then you won't get that.
Well, almost all aspects of that revolution we talked about, the institutions, has harmed, working class people.
Well, they have. It's been a complete flop.
Yeah.
On its own terms, it's been a flop. If you went into utopianism in the belief that you create a nice place, and you've actually created a sort of malfunctioning bin fire.
Yes.
It's not been good.
Tell me, Philip, because we have been quite a bit of discussion, and I think it will increase about demographics and the fact that we're not having families and such like anymore, and obviously immigration. And when people make the claim, as they increasingly do, is that the country will be minority white British by the time of the 2060s. What do you feel about that?
Well, I'm afraid as I've said before, my gorge rises and people start using terms like white. I'm very much from the generation which remembers the great Martin Luther King speech. So he should be judged by the content of his character, not the colour of his skin. And I reject all classification of people by skin colour instinctively. I'm still very much a one race, the human race person. I have not in any way shaken off that aspect of my left-wingery, and I hope I never shall. It happens to be based upon the Christian Gospels as well. So it's nothing to do with colour. If the whole question is whether we can actually integrate and create a Britain which is still British, but which contains large numbers of new people, that I accept an extremely difficult challenge under certain circumstances, but has to be the goal which what I would regard as civilized people have to seek.
So to do that, you actually have to have a British establishment that actually believes in Britain, wouldn't you?
You would have to have that, yes, and that is almost fanciful, isn't it?
That's
So you keep asking me these questions, and I keep coming back to the point. This is why I've really given up practical politics, because I can see no point at which, in the engine of politics, my ideas can mesh with power. There is nobody in power who's remotely interested in what I say. I have, in many, many years of writing stuff and saying stuff, made no difference at all of any kind. I'm 73, and you begin to think, well...
No, but it has in the sense that people have huge support for what you write. I mean, the public. I mean, maybe not.
Most people have never heard of me, but I don't. The point is, it doesn't. That's not the point. If you go into the political arena at all, and if you become a national newspaper columnist, you do. No one's elected you, but you do have a responsibility, and you do have a readership, and you have set before them a set of things which you believe in, which you wish to pursue. You do hope that at some point in all this, so it'll have some effect.
Yeah.
But it hasn't. I'm completely clear of that. Not 1/2 ounce. Nothing. Zero, because there is no such transmission bell. The only political party which is capable of attaining office, supposedly in the Conservative interest, is totally unbothered by anything that I say.
I would say, though, that I'm trying to buck you up or anything.
No,
here.
I don't. Ultimately, there are other things. Now that I'm 73, there are other things that I care about.
Right.
Actually, in many ways, more.
Well, I would say that one of the features of our current political culture is that parties are very disconnected from the world of ideas in a way that they weren't even maybe 30 years ago. I mean, all the think tanks around here and all of that, that there is no connection between the Conservative Party particularly and conservative think tanks or conservative people with ideas. Not really.
Well, they are sort of linked up fish tanks, aren't they? The same people pop up in
Yes, but really, are they interested in ideas?
Well, they're interested in ideas which they can use to. Well, it's the old Evelyn Waugh joke, isn't it? Do politicians pursue office to implement policies, or do they adopt policies so they can obtain office? Well, we all know the answer to that in general. There are very few who do the other thing, and the Conservative Party is, of recent years, particularly bereft of figures who pursue office to implement policies and who have any ideas. They're just not there. It's just from having been an organisation to obtain office for the Sons of Gentlemen, it's become another organisation to obtain office for people who've done PPE at Oxford.
Yes.
Which is in many ways even worse. At least the Sons of Gentlemen hadn't done PPE.
You said there that you're in some ways more interested in certain other things. What would those other things be then, Ben?
Oh, increasingly, I'm interested in eternity. I'm not going to be around much longer, so I have to be. My what do you might call my religious thinking is much nearer the front of my mind than my political thinking.
Isn't that what happens to us all, comes to us all?
It may well be. I can tell you it's certainly come to me. But it came to me a long time ago. I became interested in this when I rejoined the church of my childhood 40 odd years ago now, and it's become increasingly a preoccupation because I see it as more important. I see eternity as more important than the shadows of the present. More and more, you have to. It just is.
Yes.
And almost all art and literature tends in the same direction. If you begin to take it seriously. I mean, my favourite form of holiday is finding some pleasant European city with decent places to eat and a couple of good art galleries. And what I spend my time doing in art galleries is looking at what people have painted and see in so much of it the preoccupation with the eternal over the temporal, which I find increasingly satisfying.
So I see. It's not because there is this sort of idea, current at the moment that we need a kind of religious or Christian revival.
Well, we do. There's no question of that. But I don't. And there are some vague, slightly trivial signs of it in small corners. But in the mass of the people, where it really, there is no John Wesley. There is no Whitfield going around persuading the great mass of people to return to the faith of their fathers. It's not happening. Secularism is pretty much general, and you can assume it in all kinds of attitudes and decisions now.
There are quite a few younger people on the conservative side of politics. I'd say basically quite radical who are going towards Catholicism.
That's true, but they're not. These are not significant numbers.
No, they're not.
It's encouraging that anybody at all is, but it's not. You can't really claim it to be a great social movement, and that's not That's not what I'm trying to do here. I'm not trying to start a great re-evangelization of Britain. I can't even ride a horse, which I believe is important if you want to do that. So I don't. I'm not going to do it. All kinds of unpredictable things do happen in life, don't they? So who knows?
Well, look, Peter, I've got a few more short questions for you for our members. That you talked about various subjects before for them. So if you could just hang on. In the meantime, thank you very much for coming back, talking to us, and to be repeated in 6 months, I'm sure, I hope. Anyway.
Well, I hope so too.
I hope so. Thanks very much.
It has to depend on the reaction of the consumers, doesn't it?
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. That's it for this week. We should be back next week. In the meantime, do have a safe winter and happy week. Okay, thanks so much indeed. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.